How did you first come into contact with the Bangladeshi community?
Mid-1980s, Bangladeshi children arrived in the school catchment area and were presented for enrolment at the school, including the imam's children. I can give you a rough date. I do remember it was after Mrs. Gandhi had been assassinated. I remember an Indian child in the school being very upset and telling me that an awful lot of children from Bangladesh were going to arrive at the school. So that would be, I think, the mid-80s.
Right.
And gradually over the years, the number of children, Bangladeshi children in the school, increased until I would think by about 2000, when I retired, we'd be approaching 40%.
Right. Could you describe some of the people you met and what your relationships were with them?
I had a somewhat fraught relationship with the imam. I don't know if he's still around. I remember an occasion where one of the infant teachers was doing a project on World War II, and how it affected people at home front, and with the help of the school kitchen staff, they made a broth. I was thinking about it. This wonderful smell permeated the school for the morning, and the children polished it all off. And the next morning when I got into school, just before 8 o'clock, the imam was standing outside my door with steam coming out of his ears. Apparently the teacher had made the stock for the broth from ham shank. So it was a case very much of eating humble pie and crawling, but he had a number of children. One of his daughters in particular were very, very able children. And I always found him very supportive, actually. Didn't see many of the parents. They would drop the children off at school. There were problems with things like those one or two that had cars seemed to think they could drive into the school car park and deposit their children, and we had a few problems like that, but it was, my dealings were largely with children. And then I remembered the WEA, I think, organised an English as a second language group for Bangladeshi mothers. We had that in the school, and I was very pleased about that. But my dealings were largely with the children. And I think over the 15 years or whatever it was that I had dealings with the community, I can only remember ever having one, shall we say, troublesome child.
Right.
And I think he had good right, because I think their family were pestered by a particularly antisocial local boy who lived close to them. And this lad, this Bangladeshi lad, was quite truculent and quite anti-white, without being particularly violent about it in school. But we could contain him. But certainly over the years, I never had any discipline problems that were comparable to some of the problems I had with some of our disadvantaged pupils who were local. Occasionally, cultural incidents would crop up, like the one I mentioned about the broth, which I must admit I did find funny once he'd gone. Things like them not being able in art to do representations of people or animals, which I think that some of the teachers found extremely frustrating. Wanting to withdraw from RE lessons. There were certain problems with PE lessons over the girls and what they wore, swimming lessons similarly. But the biggest problem I think we had with them, on the negative side would be a practice that just didn't apply to the Bangladeshi community, it applied to Pakistani and Hindu communities as well, I understand, where they disappeared for weeks on end to visit Bangladesh in our case. And unfortunately, I took measures within the law to warn them that if they did go for longer than 3 weeks, I would take their names off the roll, which I was quite entitled to do in law. And I did it. And this caused a bit of consternation, shall we say, at the Civic Centre. Endless governors' meetings, but I refused because my belief is that these families had come to England to improve their lot, and the first thing that their children need to do is to become fluent in English, and if they're not here, we can't help them do that. And there are 6 weeks in the summer, which is a long time. There's a fortnight at Easter, there's 13 weeks holiday in the year. And I've got to say that it wasn't largely the Bangladeshi community that was causing the problem. The opposition to this was coming from councillors and full-time officials of the LEA. But I refused to compromise at all on that.
Could you say a bit more about teaching Bangladeshi children and your experience?
Extremely well behaved in the classrooms. Many of them became fluent and bilingual in a short period of time. And a lot of that was down to the work that people like Margaret Melling, Pam Cole did part-time in the school, and when we eventually began employing young Bangladeshi women. I think we only ever got one boy on the school football team, because there were obviously problems with Saturday mornings at times, especially during Ramadan. But the teaching side of it, I think by the time, if we'd had them in the school from reception or nursery, because we made a conscious effort with the authority to enrol as many Bangladeshi children as we could in nursery, so that when they started full-time education, they at least had some English and some idea of integrating or mixing with children other than Bangladeshi ones. So we did do that. And I would have said by the time we got to the upper juniors, I used to try and teach for about an hour a day somewhere in the school. I can't remember having any problems at all with upper juniors or lower juniors, even, in terms of being able to communicate any teaching points. And I never had staff coming knocking on the door saying, "I don't understand." It would be cultural issues, like the ones I've mentioned, PE, swimming, art classes, RE. And yet, to be honest, I cannot remember one Bangladeshi child opting to stay out of assemblies. I used to close the assembly every day with a Muslim prayer and the Lord's Prayer. And that seemed to be acceptable. We used to notice a distinct drop in Bangladeshi attendance if it snowed.
Right.
Which is not surprising,
No.
really. But overall, I don't know how many of them performed in the secondary schools. I know some of them went on to do rather well, because we did get feedback from time to time. But I can honestly not remember ever having any problems, either disciplinary or academic, within, you've got to remember, within the range of abilities. There were some of them who were extremely able, like the Imam's son, and a gentleman who owned a restaurant, I think in Newcastle, and I think he had 4 daughters, and they lived on Richard Avenue. And these girls, they were writing, two of them in particular who I taught, they were writing O-level style essays by the time they were in Y6. 4 or 5 paragraphs, reasoned, if it was argumentative, descriptive, with linking words. Tremendous. One or two of the boys did particularly well. I can't remember their names now. Such a while ago. But generally speaking, as far as the teaching is concerned, I think you would really need to speak to some of the people who were class teachers more than me. But I never had to have any sessions where we would sit down with the staff and say, look, we don't need to have crash courses in English for them, because we did have this backup from the authority with, as I say, Pam Cole, the late Pam Cole, sadly, and Margaret Melling in particular, that did some sterling work with the kids. And the girls who worked particularly with the infants. By the time I retired, I think we'd got 1 or 2 up into the juniors as assistants as well, because I think we found another source of funding. And I cannot honestly remember very many incidents over the years that you would call were sort of racial disharmony. Occasionally you'd have the odd squabble between a couple of boys. And now and again the odd girl would complain about being called names. But if that did happen, then we didn't hang about, we jumped on it fairly quickly. But we would have done the same if somebody had been described as 4 eyes or fatty. It's not fair to point out what could be considered to be something disadvantageous. So, we're fairly, I think we would try to be fairly consistent on that, but mistakes were made, as I did with it. Like, for example, the broth.
You already touched a lot on what my next set of questions are. But do you mind if I ask them?
Cool.
And we'll see if we can expand on anything. How easy was it to interact and develop relationships with the Bangladeshi community?
Not particularly easy from our point of view. They didn't patronise the school association very much, which was a group of people who worked outside of school hours, parents and staff, to try to bring extra benefits to the kids. But neither were they very obstructive. They used to bring them to school, leave them, collect them, and let us get on with our jobs.
Yeah.
So it wasn't easy to involve them in certain things, but I never found any of them particularly obstructive. No, there was. I can't really think of anything. Well, I know we used to have a problem with a translation service. We were sending out letters in Punjabi, and a number of the parents came to see us, and they were honest enough to say, "Well, look, the dads, we can't read." So I told the translation service that this was a waste of money, and that I would quite happily communicate orally with them if they came up to the school, because obviously throughout the school year there are letters need to go out, things, holidays, trips. So I think in the end, what was happening was that we agreed to send bilingual letters to the Bangladeshi families so that the kids could translate the letter to the parents. Right. So that the information did get across. So there are always ways and means of trying to get around these problems. No, I wouldn't have said that, they would turn up for things like summer fairs or Christmas fairs and buy things from the school. But
could you say a bit about what you think the relationship was between the Bangladeshi community and the wider population of Sunderland?
I think it would be very general. Any comment I made, I think the overall picture that was presented to us was of a community that kept themselves very much to themselves. The biggest contact we would probably have, I would suspect, would be through the restaurants that many of the fathers worked in.
Yeah.
And the school itself, if in fact the Bangladeshi parents spoke to or communicated in any way with parents other than other Bangladeshis. Mm-hmm. I don't know that. Mm-hmm. On their way up to school and on the schoolyard. They tended, I think, to keep themselves to themselves as a community.
And again, you've said something about this already, but do you think cultural differences were difficult to overcome in relationships between the wider population of Sunderland and the Bangladeshi community?
I can't speak for the wider population of Sunderland. I think the fact that we've not had many race or any race riots or large-scale fighting, as far as I know, between the indigenous youths and the Bangladeshis, who many of whom are now indigenous in the sense that they were born here and grew up here. I suppose there will be flashpoints from time to time. I'm not aware that there's any police investigation into the sort of dreadful situations that's happened in places like Rotherham and Derby with older men. So I think perhaps in Sunderland they may be fairly tolerant towards one another, but I do know that I did hear of situations where individuals were being picked on because they were brown and Bangladeshi. But I think that's going to happen anywhere. And you cannot legislate for intolerant, bigoted people all the time. All you can do is try and build into your own organisation steps to take, because they are there and they will be there for as far as the eye can see, because from what I can gather, people have this idea of belonging to a group. I mean, you have kids from Grindon knocking 7 bells out of kids from Thorny Close and such like so, because they live where they do. And let's face it, the rivalry between Sunderland and Newcastle isn't exactly, at times, good-natured. Yeah. It used to be a lot more good-natured.
Yeah.
You know, I could have I remember in the past, if I wasn't playing, I would go up, if Sunderland were away, I'd go up to St James's Park and stand on the terrace and never have any problems. Mm. But there were headbangers around then, just as there are now.
Yeah. Could you say a bit more about racism in Sunderland, whether you think it was a problem in any specific incidents that you encountered?
I can't think of any in the school. I'm sure there would be the odd ones. We did have the odd ones where people called each other names. But children do that anyway. They call fat kids fatty, and ginger kids ginger. So I think we've got to put it in perspective. But I can't remember having any real problems. To be fair to the Bangladeshi children, they kept themselves pretty much to themselves. The lads would join in with football, I would say that. The girls tended to be very much keeping themselves to themselves. But I can't think of big group games that girls played, apart from things like skipping. And if I remember rightly, the politically correct stopped us doing things like that in case somebody got strangled with a skipping rope. But you used to have large groups of girls, huge gangs of them, skipping. They used to play two-baller as well against the wall, but I remember the Bangladeshi kids doing that. So I don't think so. I can't remember. I mean, there might have been individual incidents, but nothing serious.
So outside of racism, cultural differences, and things like that, did you have a perception of other challenges that the Bangladeshi community faced?
I suppose there's always the linguistic one. Mm-hmm. I think they would have. I do know that they did have problems for some of the mothers who tended to be very much based in the house and didn't mix with, as far as I understood, people other than Bangladeshis, and they would have linguistic problems, I would guess. And I would imagine the men would too. Mm. And it's an awfully difficult thing to do, to go and live in another country, especially in a country where they don't speak your language. And your religion is, in fact, not the paramount one. Yeah. So I have a lot of sympathy for them, but my impression was that overall they kept themselves to themselves. But that would appear to be the case with immigrant groups all over the world. I mean, what do the Scots do? They go abroad and form a Birds Club and a St Andrews Society. The Italians create Little Italy in Manhattan.
Do you think the Bangladeshi community has been able to overcome some of the challenges they've faced since they arrived here?
Well, certainly talking to those two ex-pupils they have, and I'm sure there are plenty of others that you'll know more than I will, who've succeeded in what is, if you like, a Christian Occidental society. Yeah. And more power to their elbows, as far as I'm concerned. And the fact that Munia's sister, or one of their sisters, has gone to university, I rejoice in. Because to me, to have 50% of your group relegated to being domestics, all right, I'm being controversial here, I think is a bit wasteful.
What do you think the Bangladeshi communities contributed to Sunderland?
Well, obviously they've improved the culinary climate greatly. I think perhaps for many people in Sunderland, I think they've made, because Sunderland is a pretty insular place, you know, if you think it's not on a main route, it's not a port anymore, and it never really has been much of a port. I think it made a lot of Sunderland people realise that living with people or living close to people with other beliefs and another culture was very important for them. I think the fact that we haven't had race riots, the fact that we haven't had people's houses torched, says a lot for the people of Sunderland and their levels of tolerance. Yeah. I suppose it's the same in Newcastle, up at Benwell as well, isn't it? Not Benwell, up the Westgate Road, where they have a large Pakistani community, don't they? So I do think that it's helped widen people's visions and perhaps made them a bit more tolerant. Mm-hmm. I suppose it will be people out there and rush to join the National Front and the British, whatever it is, party. But I think the fact that we just don't see evidence of interracial trouble, particularly, I think is very encouraging.
Do you think Sunderland's communities become more tolerant over time? Do you think it's more?
Who are we talking about here? The Bangladeshi community or Sunderland as a community?
As a whole, do you think it's become more tolerant since the 60s, say?
They've certainly been exposed to it in the media. I suppose you could say the rise of a couple of the more odious parties on the right would suggest that there may be opposition to this, but they haven't done particularly well in Sunderland, have they?
Do you think life's improved for the Bangladeshi community since they came here?
In what respect? Economically?
Economically, socially, culturally?
I would think economically, definitely. Well, I know it has because of things that people like Leslie have told me. The fact that many of them drive cars. Wouldn't be doing that in Bangladesh, would they? Yeah. That they may own restaurants as well as work in them, and shops. Okay, the climate isn't as pleasant, no doubt. But then again, we don't get massive floods.
Yeah.
We don't get monsoon rains, and so I think economically they're probably, which is maybe the main reason why they came, they're probably much better off. I remember one lady, Carol, she was a district nurse who did a lot for the community, the Bangladeshi community. I remember her telling me that 1 week's family allowance and housing benefit was, for some of them, this was back in the 80s, I think, the equivalent of what they would make in a year from subsistence farming. Yeah. So, all right, things are a bit more expensive here, but cars, TVs, they fly back to Bangladesh from time to time. Yeah. So economically, they're better off. Culturally, I don't know. I think you'd really have to talk to a wide range of Bangladeshis about that. But I think for them to be exposed to a liberal Christian culture, it will certainly have aspects that they will disapprove of. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I don't think they can miss the fact that the rule of law is very, very important here. I don't know if Bangladesh is still one of the most corrupt countries in the world according to the UNESCO, but I think they'll have noticed that here politicians and dignitaries, when they misbehave and they get caught, go to prison. I understand that doesn't happen too often in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. So that might be an eye-opener for them. And certainly the fact that they've learnt English opens up the whole world of the English written word, which must be a massive advantage for them. I suspect popular music might be a downside to that, but with its infantile lyrics, but certainly they have the opportunities like public libraries, book clubs. And I do remember children at home, I do remember children at school, some of them being extremely voracious readers. In fact, there was one lad I had to punish because he was lifting readers from the shelf, shoving them under his jacket to take home, and I caught him. He didn't do it again. But I thought, well, if you are going to borrow things from school, I'm glad it's books. So yes, I think that side of it must be tremendous for them. I think perhaps an opportunity to see where people can look at evidence and look at many sides of a problem and then come to a balanced conclusion. I'm not saying that this doesn't exist in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, but that everybody has access, in theory, to that particular form of thought, I think must be wonderful for them. And the fact that, what is it? I think it's 17% of British millionaires and multimillionaires is inherited wealth, whereas America it's 70-odd%, France and Germany the same. So here, even Wayne Rooney can become a millionaire. And rightly so, he's very good at what he does. But if you want to be a professional person, that route's open to you as well if you've got the talent. Whether that applies in Bangladesh, I suspect it probably doesn't, but I don't know for sure. If it did, why would it be here?
What about in terms of integration? Do you think integration has improved over time?
I can't remember seeing any Bangladeshi people in local hostelries chewing the fat in the pubs, but it may be that some of the younger people, for example, go to bars that I would not frequent, not that I go to many these days. I don't know how many of them go regularly, say, to things like the theatre. It will be difficult for the adults because many of them will work in the evenings. Yeah. It would be impossible for me to make an informed comment on that. And all I can say is that I don't see in the press evidence of the opposite happening. Right. But certainly it would seem, because of all sorts of reasons, that as a group they're not as, say, outgoing as, say, West Indians or some of the Africans. And that's a sweeping generalisation, I know. But you look, for example, at sport, professional sport in this country, and you can find a small number of Pakistanis playing top-class cricket, a small number of Indians, but a great number of West Indians, people of West Indian descent, playing professional football, playing professional cricket, boxing. And I think that's always a sign of integration, because if they're playing it, they must be going to watch it.
Yeah.
So I look forward to the day when I see a Bangladeshi player actually playing down here.
Yeah.
And I think then we could say, well, integration is really, really succeeding.
Yeah.
Because let's face it, if you could, professional sport is a way to certainly make a lot. But it is a way for people from the lower income groups to become successful and rich.
Yeah. Do you have any ideas about how you think things could improve for the community?
I think all that can happen, I think all you can do to try and improve things for the community is for the majority of the larger community in Sunderland, whatever it's made up of, to keep inviting people from the Bangladeshi community to events, to social gatherings on a regular and irregular basis, and to try and include them as much as they possibly can. But I think to try to force integration would just cause animosity. And I'm sure that we've got a generation of Bangladeshi young people growing up now who will find it much, much easier to relate and integrate with, shall we say, the white population than their parents and grandparents will have done, because they can speak the language, they can read.
Yeah.
So, but I do think you've got to be careful that you don't try to force the issue.
Yeah.
And schools have a big part to play in that, don't they? Because you've got to go.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to know how many of the Bangladeshi community are going into private education now.
Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't know.
Might be worth you while following that one.
Yeah. That's the end of the scheme. I was just wondering if I could ask you a bit more about, you mentioned Peter Hudson.
Yeah, Peter was the LEA English advisor, but he also had a responsibility for, at the time, small numbers of immigrant children who had English as a second language. And the Bangladeshis arrived in numbers, and certainly his brief for that particular part of his job increased greatly. But he was very supportive of the community. I know that. He used to attend events and invite them into schools, invite them to other things, like the Sunderland Society he was a member of. And whenever there was anything in any of the schools where there were large numbers of Bangladeshi children going on, like a performance, he would be there. And he certainly would come out if you had a problem, as did Steve Woodward.
Right.
And as I say, Margaret Melling and the late Pam Cole, like Peter, unfortunately, she's dead, they used to actually sit down with Bangladeshi children and work on the language work with them. And they did invaluable work.